What's up, YouTube? Today we are looking at Sumu by Madrona Labs, which is a additive slash spectral synth that's based around this kind of modular system. And I think one of the truly special things about this is that it has a kind of component app that allows you to turn wave files into these like super complex wavetables. So with traditional wavetables, the harmonics, like the intervals between the harmonics, are fixed. They're usually a fixed ratio. Sometimes with some spectral effects, they give you the ability to bend those slightly, but you never have full control to kind of like turn a organic sound into something without those fixed harmonics, right? And almost all sounds in nature, almost all organic sounds, won't have that exact ratio of harmonics. If we look at something like a string sound or a woodwind sound or a glassy sound, they all have these kind of like slight inharmonicities that give them that kind of organic texture. So this makes this synth really cool for really bending the boundaries of what's possible in the kind of wavetable world, but looking at it through the scope of kind of like additive and FM synthesis. I think one of the coolest things about this as well is that you have the ability to send the pitch information to different parts of the synth. So you can modulate different parts of the reverb, different parts of the other types of the synth based on those partials, right? So it's really crazy what you can do. It is pretty experimental, so it's kind of more for sound design and that kind of thing, and less for your kind of average leads, basses, and that kind of thing. But it's really special because it truly does something different that I don't think I've seen in a VST plugin before. So anyway, for full disclosure, this is not a sponsored video. However, I did get a copy sent to me of the plugin, not by Madrona Labs, but I was actually chatting to another developer, and they were like, hey, this is a friend of ours. We think you will like their plugins as well. And they sent them to me. So I did actually end up liking this one in particular, but I like the idea of most of their plugins, which are kind of based around this modular system in the middle here, where you can kind of route most modulations to most destinations and stuff like that. So it's not really a fixed architecture synth like a lot of the other kind of stuff like this, right? The other elephant in the room, of course, is the price. It's not cheap. It's, I think, $129. But hopefully in this video, I'll show you kind of like how unique it is and how different it is. And then you can make up your own mind whether you think it's worth it. One thing to note is that there is a demo mode, and I do believe it's kind of like an extended evaluation thing. You just get this kind of noise that plays every now and then, and a pop up on screen, but they don't have any kind of like invasive DRM or anything like that built in, which I think is really, really cool. Okay, so anyway, blabbering out of the way, let's dive into the plugin and have a look. So just looking at the plugin, it's really easy to understand kind of what's going on here, but the complexity is kind of hidden behind how intuitive the actual interface is, right? So remember what I was saying about the different intervals, right? Like in a wavetable synth, these would traditionally be like fixed intervals. So if we have a look at these harmonics from Vital Saw Wave, you'll see that these intervals are kind of like fixed at a ratio, right? And when we change the pitch, it doesn't actually change those intervals, right? When we compare that to, but you'll see like these partials are a lot more complex. You have these main intervals and then you have this like texture in between. And it's a lot more reminiscent of something that you would see in a real world recording, right? And the cool thing about this is that we have the control to kind of like remove some of those partials and that kind of thing. So for example, here we can reduce the mod index. So what that's going to do, it's going to turn down the FM that's in the synth, right? And by doing that, it'll make the waveform a bit less complex. By doing that, we'll kind of like simplify the waveform, but we still have a bit of this texture coming through based on our spectral map, which we've created, right? So like I said, there's a bunch of factory stuff built in here, from like acoustic sounds to voice sounds. So here, for example, we have one that's a little bit more reminiscent of like the Vital one, but it still has that kind of movement because we have individual control over the partials, right? Let's find one of those vocal sounds because you can get some cool stuff here with these like oohs and ahs. That's crazy, right? For a synthesizer, that's absolutely crazy. Okay, so some of the really cool things that we can do here is, obviously, because it's modular, we have kind of full control over the inputs and the outputs and that kind of thing. So say, for example, we want to just loop like a small chunk. We don't want to play this whole audio file. What we can do is we can remove this time setting, right? And then actually set loop mode on and then give it like a time here. Because then we can kind of scrub through it. You know what I mean? How we want. And then what I usually do is I put the time on this, which is like the modulator input. And then this can determine like the speed, right? So if you put it really low, you can get these kind of slow sounds. And then just isolate like one of those parts of that phrase. Okay, so one of the coolest things about this is also the spatialization system built in here. So it's not quite a reverb, but think about it as like a reverb in which you can place individual partials based on their XYZ, if you set it up that way, right? So if we send this pitch to either like the X, Y, or Z input, then it's going to map those partials to different spatialization parameters. So for example, the Y, this would be the modulation amount. So then based on the pitch of that partial, it's going to change its Y parameter. And we can also apply stuff like an LFO to the X and the Z, or we can rotate the entire structure with this parameter here and the speed. So what I want to do is I want to set this filter to through, so it's not actually affecting the sound. We can change the style of room here by clicking on this to large room. And we can spin the room with this theta parameter. To get a slightly more pure tone, so you hear there's that kind of the tones and then there's that kind of hiss on top of the tones because it's like a vocal recording. We can use this noise output to reduce that. So how it works is this is what generates the partials, and it sends through these cables here, it sends to these oscillators. And then the oscillators are what are creating the sound. So the traditional patch with Sumu would be mapping the amp, pitch, and noise to and pitch and noise input of the oscillators, right? Because then that partial map generates the tones from the oscillators. But you're not limited to doing it that way, right? You could reduce the noise just so it's purer tones, and then perhaps send that noise information to one of the reverb parameters or something like that. So you can get really sort of experimental with these kinds of things to create these kind of really otherworldly sounds, literally. So just so it's not so dry, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little bit of Valhalla Supermassive on here. And let's just go with something like medium 80s. That's insane. Okay, so let me quickly explain this pulses system over here. Imagine an LFO for each partial, right? That's what this is, basically. It's like an LFO or envelope or looping envelope for every single partial. Or maybe not every single one, but it's basically mapped across the spectrum. And these blue lines that are running up basically represent the phase. So you can kind of see the shape, you can kind of slow the entire thing down. The cool thing is here, you can kind of choose. So that blue background, I guess that's the kind of modulation amount per spectral band. So then you can kind of filter that modulation like this, and you can change various different things, like offset them. You can add a bit of randomness using this noise parameter here. And then you can also send in all sorts of input to that. So we could map this to any other parameters in the system, right? Which is pretty cool. So we could also send these out. So let's say, for example, send the all out to the Z input of the spatialization input. So I quickly want to talk about the companion app, which is how you would get your own sounds into Sumu, right? So the app is called Vutu. It's also available on the Madrona website, and it's free. And I believe that the code is open source because of the licensing involved. It's based on another system called Loris. That's the reason why it's a companion app, but also it's a pretty hefty offline process, so it makes sense. So anyway, let's go through how we would import sounds here. So not too long ago, I actually released a pack which was for granular synths, right? It's got a bunch of like metallic bowed rulers and springs and all sorts of other weird sounds like that, right? And a lot of these sounds, you can really hear that there's kind of weird harmonics going on, right? So these are a great example to load in here. Okay, so I already know that this sample is in D, and one of the things about this is you've got to actually punch in the tune of the note to kind of hear what's going on, right? So if we go analyze, it's going to analyze that file and then give us what that sort of wavetable inside Sumu would look like, right? So from here, we would then have to go synthesize and then export, okay? But we just want to make sure that we have the correct note, because that's one of the things about this system that's kind of automatic in some wavetable synths and that kind of thing. So we also have some parameters here, but I'm not going to go too in depth with what those are doing. But here what we can do is we can figure out the root note here. We're going to want to set this fundamental to what frequency that is. So we could actually pull up a note to frequency chart. Actually got one here, which we can pull up. And D would be somewhere around 293.66, I think. So we can move this up. That sounds a bit closer to what we want. In fact, we can maybe go an octave down, because if we look at this, you can see that the fundamental is actually lower here. I think it's maybe 2 octaves down. Let's check what the frequency of the 2 octaves down would be. 73.42. Let's just see what this sounds like. No, it's not that. It's around the 100 mark. Probably 146.83. I'm actually just going to go visually, because this kind of sounds about right. Maybe it somehow pitched the thing, right? So what we can do is fundamental volume down, synthesize, and then export. And then we want to put this into any folder on the computer. Okay, so here we are back in Sumu. How would we get that file into the plugin? We go like this, click on these 3 dots, import folder, and then we find that folder which had the files, right? So for some reason, it just imports it like into the main folder here. We can actually jump into apps, use the data, that folder, and actually rearrange it if you want to. But just for now, I'm going to just load it up straight from here. And you can see it's loaded up that partial data here for us. So now we can have access to like the pitch and the noise and all that kind of thing. So let's play around a little bit just with this and the default settings in the plugin. That's a crazy bass sound. So what we're doing here is we're basically taking out the pitch information and just using the amplitude information. What could be cool is to perhaps add like a wave shaper here. So I'm actually going to add Bitwig's filter plus, just turn off the filter of it and just use the wave shaper that's built in here. Maybe we can add a little bit of the noise signal just to give it like some mid-range. Okay, let's try with a reverb, more of like a pad type sound. That's so sick. And it's so realistic and organic sounding, even though it's very digital sounding and it's based on like additive synthesis, which is usually very digital sounding. They've managed to kind of capture this truly complex sound engine in something that's really easy to play with and really intuitive, you know what I mean? So especially for sound design and cinematic and soundscapes and that kind of thing. I mean, you can hear here with just a bit of playing around and experimentation, we're able to create this really immense soundscape. Do you know what I mean? With just the plugin and a reverb. Very, very, very cool stuff. So yeah, I think that about sums it up. Let me know what you think in the comments. As always, if you haven't yet, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. A big thanks to Madrona Labs for making this video happen, and thanks to you for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I hope to see you next time. Cheers.